In 1966, the Harden Trio released Tippy Toeing. It was a huge hit, topping the country and pop charts. It was the perfect anthem for the whole family to sing along to. But just a year later, tragedy struck. It wasn't some dramatic event like a plane crash or a drug overdose. It was a single question posed by Columbia Records. We only need one. Why should we pay the price of three? And they put their answer to that question into action. They offered Arlene Harden a solo contract and they dumped Robyn and Bobby. In an instant, the family was torn apart. One member became a star. The other two were completely erased by the success they achieved together. To understand the sound that would one day, for a brief shining moment, take Nashville by storm, you have to understand the world it came from. And that world was not the slick, ambitious, neon-lit world of Nashville, Tennessee. It was England, Arkansas. On June 27, 1935, Robert Lee Bobby Harden was born. This wasn't just the tail end of the Great Depression. It was the desperate, dusty heart of it. It was the Dust Bowl, a time of economic and environmental collapse, a time straight out of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Where families were torn apart by the winds, Arkansas wasn't as directly affected as Oklahoma, but countless tenant farmers, driven by drought and debt, were forced to migrate west or north. Bobby was born into a poor, working-class family in one of the poorest regions of the American South. It was a world of sharecropping, a world where debts to company stores were unavoidable. The family relied on two things, and only two, to survive each day: the harsh, unforgiving land and their unwavering Christian faith. Bobby's parents were devout. His family life was firmly anchored in the physical and spiritual realities of the local Baptist church, not the bank or the government. In this household, music wasn't a form of entertainment, much less a luxury or a hobby. It was a form of prayer, a necessity as essential as bread. The gospel harmonies they sang together weren't for applause, they were for salvation. The Southern Baptist tradition in this region in particular was deeply influenced by community choirs like Shape Note and Sacred Harp. This tradition emphasized not individual virtuosity or solo stars, but rather the entire community taking on their own parts to create a single powerful harmony. Bobby grew up breathing this air, not with the polished sounds of distant radio stars, but with the raw voices around the dinner table, singing of grace, hardship, and resilience. This was the environment that cultivated and honed his voice and, by extension, his entire identity. He didn't learn to sing in the traditional sense, he simply did it as a function of being alive. As he grew older, his voice settled into a deep, powerful, and grounded baritone. It wasn't the sharp, lonely, high-pitched sound of the Appalachians, like the Carter family or the Carlisle brothers. It was the rich, earthy, and resonant sound of the Arkansas Delta, a voice like the red clay of his native soil, steady, strong, and unwavering. This voice and the role it played defined his life. As the eldest brother, he was the anchor. He was the root of harmony, the unwavering center around which his family's harmony would later be built. Bobby Harden's childhood doesn't feature the acute trauma of being forced into the coal mines like Cliff Carlisle, but the absence of this single violent trauma hints at another, perhaps deeper psychological foundation. Bobby's suffering wasn't the excruciating physical pain of a single dangerous job. It was the chronic, grinding, daily humiliation of post-Great Depression poverty. It was a quiet, constant realization that the world was unstable, that a single drought could wipe everything out, and that security was nothing more than a fiction. This kind of upbringing didn't produce serious poets obsessed with artistry like Cliff Carlisle, nor did it produce manic clowns desperate for attention like his brother Bill Carlisle. It created something uniquely Harden, the tenacious provider. Bobby's psychology became one of quiet, independent, and relentless perseverance. His primary motivation wasn't fame or even artistry. From that early age, his primary motivation was stability. His goal wasn't simply to escape poverty. His goal was to overcome poverty, to defeat it, and to build a permanent wall of financial and emotional stability for his family. This gospel grit is fundamentally different from the Carlisle brothers' coal mine trauma. The Carlisle brothers' story is about the internal battle between seriousness and joy. Two brothers who turned against each other in reaction to their trauma. The Harden story is the opposite. Their gospel upbringing taught them that the only way to overcome hardship was togetherness. Harmony itself was the lesson. You don't compete with other voices. You support them, blend with them, and suppress your own ego to create a sound stronger than the individual parts. Bobby's entire life was defined by this ethos. His role was to be the foundation upon which others could build. This psychology is key to the entire story. It explains his drive, his leadership, and his ambition to bring his family to Nashville. But it also explains the profound and heartbreaking tragedy that lay ahead. Bobby was the father and the foundation. He dedicated his life to building a foundation for his family. The tragedy is that the Nashville machine used that foundation not to celebrate his family, but to lift one member off the foundation and discard the rest. He built a fortress. But the industry politely invited his sister to leave and locked the door behind her. 10 years after Bobby's birth, his younger sisters joined him. The war ended, and around 1945, Dolores Arlene Harden was born, followed by Robbie, the youngest. They were part of the post-war baby boom generation, born into a slightly more prosperous and optimistic America. The worst of the Great Depression was over, but the core values of their family, forged in its fires, remained unchanged. The Baptist Church remained the center of their universe, and gospel music remained their language. Bobby was now a teenager, a powerful baritone with a foundation, and now had two new bright voices to complement him. The sound that would become a legend was about to be born if the Everly Brothers' daily classroom was the professional pressures of a commercial radio show. The Harden kids had a far more rigorous training ground. Sunday morning Baptist church services. In the rural Southern Baptist tradition, singing wasn't optional and harmony wasn't a talent. It was a fundamental and mandatory expression of community and faith. Right here in the church's pews and choir, their family harmony sound wasn't simply discovered. It was meticulously and relentlessly designed. This wasn't a simple sing-along, but a rigorous technical training. They were a perfect match genetically and spiritually. In musical terms, they were a perfect, complete triad within themselves. It all starts with Bobby as the eldest. He provides the root. His deep, steady baritone is the solid musical ground beneath their feet. He holds the first degree of the chord, the note that gives the harmony its name and power. His role is not to shine brightly. His role is to fit in. He is the anchor, and without him, the rest of the voices would drift away. Building on that solid foundation was Arlene, the middle child. She possessed a voice that was the complete opposite of Bobby's. A bright, clear, and surprisingly powerful tenor. Her voice had a natural edge, a powerful sharpness that could soar above melodies and captivate listeners. She was the fifth of the chord, the note that provided power, brilliance, and forward momentum. Even at a young age, it was clear that Arlene's voice was the star of the show, an instrument of pure, undeniable commercial talent. And finally, tying it all together is Robbie, the youngest sibling. Her soft, supple, sweet alto voice is the glue. Her role is, in many ways, the most challenging. She is the third of the chord, the note that determines whether a chord is major or minor, defining its entire emotional quality. Robbie must find the delicate but extremely close harmonies, caught between her brother and sister. She must restrain her volume to blend her voice perfectly, binding them together into a single, sparkling, inseparable unit. This became their life throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. As Bobby entered his teens, the performance began to take shape. They weren't yet a trio. They were simply a bunch of Church of England kids who could sing really well. They left the church and began performing at local county fairs, community gatherings, and small-town radio programs in Arkansas. They were a wholesome, charismatic, and incredibly talented family unit. They were the very embodiment of rural American virtue. At first, they sang standard gospel songs they had learned in church, like Amazing Grace, I'll Fly Away, and Will the Lord's Circle Break Down? However, influenced by the raspy sounds of the Grand Ole Opry on the radio, they began blending those sacred harmonies with the secular sounds of traditional country music. They took songs by Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell, singing them as hymns rather than solos. This fusion was their secret weapon. It was the sound of Saturday night honky-tonk meets Sunday morning church pew. They were different from the polished, worldly brother duos, like the Everly Brothers. They possessed what the industry would later call gospel roots. Their harmonies had a different texture, tighter, more complex, and they sang with an unwavering, soulful conviction that other performers simply couldn't replicate. It was the sound of a family bound by blood, a shared faith, and a shared burning ambition to gradually transcend their humble, rural origins. This was their apprenticeship. They honed their skills here long before they ever set foot in a recording studio. As the 1950s progressed, Bobby's tough father personality began to surface. Local festivals and church gatherings were no longer enough. While the applause was welcome, it didn't pay the bills. The drive his post-Great Depression childhood had instilled in him, the need to overcome and achieve true, lasting financial stability, melded with his artistic ambitions. He saw what they had. He knew their unique family-like sound was special, superior to many performers heard on the radio. He was the leader, the baritone foundation, and the decision maker. Their sound was too big to be confined to Arkansas, England. They had to go where the music was made. The exact date is unknown, but in the early 1960s, the Harden family took the ultimate leap of faith. Bobby, now a young man, packed his teenage sisters into the car and left the only home they had ever known. They left behind the security of their church community and the familiarity of the local radio station and drove 350 miles east on Interstate 70. They were headed to Nashville, Tennessee. It's hard to overstate how monumental and terrifying a gamble this was for a family like theirs. They were 3 kids from rural Arkansas, without connections, contracts, or plans. Armed only with their faith and their voices, they were walking into the lion's den. The Nashville they arrived in was at the height of its golden age while simultaneously suffering from a profound identity crisis. This was the undeniable peak of the Nashville sound, a time when producers like RCA's Chet Atkins and Decca's Owen Bradley were actively and successfully shedding country music's hillbilly image. This Nashville sound followed a commercial pop formula, a reaction to the sound the Harden Trio had brought to town. Producers smoothed out rough edges and actively eliminated fiddles and steel guitars, replacing them with lush string sections, polished piano, and sophisticated slip note vocalists like Patsy Cline, Jim Reeves, and Eddie Arnold. The sound of Nashville in 1963 was sophisticated, urban, smooth, and pop. It was the sound of tuxedos, not work clothes. Into this slick, commercial uptown world stepped the Harden Trio. They were the exact opposite of the Nashville sound. They were raw, they were rural, they were acoustic, and they were steeped in the hillbilly gospel tradition that the city was desperately trying to forget. Their entire sound was built on the rough acoustic family harmonies that were considered hopelessly outdated. In a word, they were country, and in Nashville in the early 1960s, country was a dirty word. Their first few years in Nashville must have been arduous. They were just another hopeful performer in a town brimming with talent. They were a drop in the ocean of talent. They rented a small, cheap apartment, splitting their meager savings and relying on each other to survive. They would spend their days traipsing up and down Music Row, knocking on publishers' doors and trying to land auditions from producers who wouldn't even spare them 30 seconds. At night, they would play for pocket change in the small, smoky, and often dangerous clubs of Printer's Alley and Lower Broadway, singing their pure, gospel-infused harmonies to rooms filled with drunken tourists and cynical industry insiders. You can imagine the constant, soul-crushing rejection. You can hear the polite but firm feedback from producers. You guys are fantastic, guys. Seriously, those harmonies are so tight, but we can't sell this. It's too churchy. Or, much more likely, the sound is good, but who's the star? We don't sell trio, we sell singers. Come back when one of you wants a solo contract. This constant rejection must have tested their familial bonds to the limit. This is where 99% of family groups break down. Pressure, poverty, and homesickness breed anger. The clown turns his back on the poet. Harmony is shattered. But it was at this point that Bobby's independent and resilient spirit, forged during the Great Depression, became their lifeline. He was the foundation of the baritone, not only musically but also emotionally. In this role, he was the top dog, possessing a pathological drive to provide the stability they always craved. He refused to give up. He wouldn't allow his sisters to become discouraged. He was the one who went out and found work, paid the rent, and made sure they had food, and he refused to change their sound. This is the critical and heroic part of his story. He knew what they had was special. He knew their church-like, family-like sound was their only unique weapon. He wouldn't let producers smooth them over, turning them into another mediocre pop country group. He kept them together. He kept them practicing. He kept them believing. With that stubborn Arkansas tenacity, he waited for just one person to hear what he had to say. After several years of this grueling and unrewarding time, in 1964, the door finally opened. A producer at Columbia Records, one of the big three labels, heard their voices. Columbia, home to crossover pop stars like Johnny Cash and Ray Price, was aggressively building its country division. Perhaps this producer, Frank Jones, was looking for something different, authentic, a contrast to the polish of RCA and Decca. He heard the Harden Trio's unique blood-soaked harmonies, Bobby's deep, steady baritone, Arlene's soaring star-like tenor, and Robbie's tight, perfect alto, and he took a gamble. The Harden Trio, kids from the Arkansas English Baptist Church, signed with the major label Columbia Records. The gamble paid off. A dream was about to take flight. Signing with Columbia Records in 1964 wasn't a guarantee of instant stardom. It was the beginning of a new, more refined, and far more chaotic struggle, the Harden Trio, with their raw, gospel-infused family harmonies, were an alien presence. They were square pegs, and the Nashville machine, the pinnacle of the smooth, polished Nashville sound, was a factory built to produce round holes. Columbia producers were intrigued by their unique sound, but they had no idea what to do with them. They were a puzzle no one could solve. Their first year on a major label was a frustrating and soul-crushing education in commercial compromise. They were sent to the studio, where producers essentially tried to make them sound like everyone else. They were pressured to trim their church-like edges, step back from the mic, and let the lush string sessions and polished backing vocals of Nashville's A-Team take the lead. Their early singles, released in 1964 and 1965, like A Little Bit of This, were good songs, but they were mongrel, a musical mix. They were a murky compromise between the Harden Trio's raw Arkansas tenacity and the label's slick pop demands. And those songs flopped. These early singles vanished one by one without a trace. They were too country for pop stations, too pop for hardcore country stations. They were lost in the middle. For Bobby, this was a terrifying echo of his childhood anxieties. His grand gamble, his tough drive to Nashville, seemed to be crumbling. The financial security he'd promised his sisters was evaporating. They were now just another failed group, 1 year into their contract, without a hit record. They were on the verge of being released, and they were headed back to England, Arkansas. A failure. The pressure must have been immense. It was a moment when the family bond that had overcome poverty was tested by the failure of their dreams. Bobby, the foundation of the baritone, had to hold them together. We can imagine the late-night conversations in their small apartment, the doubts, the fears, and his strong father spirit refusing to crumble. He knew they had one last chance, one last session, to prove that their sound, their real sound, wasn't the problem. The problem was the material. They needed the right song. He didn't find the song in a publisher's office. He didn't get it from a successful Music Row songwriter. He wrote it himself. Tippy Toeing wasn't born from a slick commercial formula, but from the very essence of their family identity. Bobby Harden, the serious patriarch and baritone leader, ironically wrote a song that perfectly fused the seriousness and joy that had divided the Carlisle brothers. A poet, he wrote the perfect vehicle for the clown. On the surface, the song was a simple, upbeat, and infectious novelty song about a man sneaking around to meet his lover. But musically, it was a work of genius, a Trojan horse. From the beginning, this song was designed to showcase the Harden Trio's specific talents, the very gospel elements the producers were trying to suppress. It wasn't a solo song with backup. It was a true call and response, three-part spiritual, cleverly disguised as a country pop hit. It was built around their greatest strength, harmony. Bobby designed the song so that his steady rhythmic baritone would serve as the lead instrument, a driving percussive foundation. The line, Tippy Toeing, wasn't just a melody. It was a vocal riff that supported the entire song. This call and response structure was taken directly from the gospel jubilee held at their church, and it created the perfect empty space for the sisters' voices to explode. Arlene's bright, soaring tenor and Robbie's dense, mingling alto would collide with the song's irresistible, sparkling energy. It was the perfect blend of their identities. It had the driving, raw country rhythms of their country roots. It had the bright, sing-along call and response structure of gospel jubilee. And it had the undeniably catchy, happy hooks that were perfectly suited to commercial radio. Bobby solved the puzzle. He managed to stay 100% true to their church-like sound while simultaneously creating an undeniable A-list commercial hit. In early 1966, they took this demo to their next Columbia session. It was a crucial moment, desperate for a hit song to justify the label's investment and prove its commercial potential. Producer Frank Jones heard Bobby's demo of Tippy Toeing. It was fast. It was simple. Perhaps to his ears, it sounded like just another novelty song. but it was addictive. In a town built on hits, addiction was worth a try. He likely considered it a throwaway song for the session and approved the recording. The legendary A-Team studio musicians could play simple 3-chord songs like this in their sleep. But the Harden Trio didn't treat this song as a throwaway. It was their life. They stood before the microphone. Bobby, Arlene, and Robbie gathered together as if they were in an Arkansas church. The producer shouted, 1, 2, 3, and magic happened. Session musicians, who had expected a standard, powerless family band, suddenly straightened up. Bobby's baritone wasn't just about singing notes, it led the entire song with its percussive and rhythmic power. And then the sisters burst into harmony. That pure, blood-soaked, gospel-sounding sound filled the studio. It wasn't the polished, breathy sound of a pop group. It was bright, loud, raw, and perfectly, miraculously, in tune. It was the sound of the rural South, unfiltered, bursting out of a high-quality Nashville studio. The call and response was thrilling. It was the sound of a family picnic, the sound of a church gathering, the sound of pure, unadorned joy. The producer behind the glass window, preparing to move on to the next song, suddenly leaned forward. The seasoned session musicians, who had worked on thousands of records, were smiling. They were tapping their feet. They were in love with the song. It was over in 2 minutes and 33 seconds. They had captured it. They had caught lightning in a bottle. It wasn't the slick Nashville sound. It was something else, something new. And everyone in the room, from the cynical engineer to the skeptical producer, knew one thing for sure. They had just recorded a hit song. Columbia Records may have been baffled by the song's uneven sound, but they knew a hit when they heard it. They recorded a single and released it in 1966. What happened next wasn't a slow burn. It was a wildfire. The song blew up country radio. In a landscape dominated by Eddie Arnold's soft, slow ballads and George Jones's barroom heartbreak, Tippy Toeing was a breath of fresh country air. It was completely different from everything else being played. Disc jockeys, tired of the same polished formula, seized on this song. It was fun. It was infectious. It was real. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The phone lines were ringing. The jukeboxes played it until the groove wore out. The song soared up the charts, a grassroots phenomenon that few labels could keep up with, reaching number 2 on Billboard's Hot Country Singles chart. It was a career-making, life-changing smash hit. The kids from Arkansas suddenly became superstars. But the real story, the one that caught the attention of even Columbia executives in New York, was the crossover Tippy Toeing. Didn't just stay on the country charts. It leaped over the fence. It landed on top 40 pop radio. It was playing in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, right next to the Mamas and the Papas and the Monkees. The song reached a staggering number 44 on the Billboard Hot 100, a remarkable achievement for a raw, unknown country group in 1966. This was the true crossover hit that producers and label presidents dreamed of, creating careers and amassing fortunes. The gamble paid off. Bobby Harden's unwavering faith in his family's church-like sound was vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. He did it. He achieved the financial stability he always craved, and he did it together as a family. Overnight, the Harden family's lives changed. They were no longer desperate, unknown Arkansas kids, indistinguishable from the thousands of other hopefuls. They were stars. They were the hottest newcomers in country music. The talk of Music Row, the family harmony sound, once dismissed by producers as too old-fashioned, was now the biggest and most contemporary sound in the country. They were the very definition of a Cinderella story. Now fully operational, Columbia machine rushed to capitalize on their runaway hit. Their debut album, Tippy Toeing, was also released in 1966 and sold incredibly well. It was a perfect snapshot of who they were, a wonderful blend of their new country hits and the powerful gospel standards that had shaped them. It was a statement. This wasn't a manufactured group. This was the real deal. They were immediately in high demand, booked for endless national tours. They were invited to the Grand Ole Opry, the pinnacle of country music. Stepping onto the hallowed stage of Ryman Auditorium was the ultimate symbol of their arrival. They became regulars on contemporary TV music shows like The Porter Wagoner Show and American Bandstand. They were wholesome, charismatic, and their sound was undeniable. Their dreams were realized in a way bigger and brighter than they could have imagined. They continued their success with their second and final album, Sing Their Favorites, in 1967. As historical analysis suggests, they were true pioneers. They were one of the earliest and most successful mixed-gender family harmony groups in the 1960s country scene. They were proving, in real time, that a family unit could sell records in a market almost entirely dominated by male solo stars. They were paving the way for a wave of family groups that would follow, from the Mandrills in the 70s to the Judds in the 80s. They were at the absolute pinnacle. They achieved fame. They gained wealth. They preserved their families. They preserved their faith. They seemed to have defeated the system. But this is where the story changes. Because the system, the Nashville machine, wasn't defeated. It was simply analyzing. It was watching them, and it began dissecting what made them special, to find ways to make them more profitable. The machine discovered a problem, and that problem was Arlene. This is the quiet tragedy at the heart of the Harden Trio. It wasn't an internal war, a bitter feud between siblings like the Carlisle brothers. The presented material rightly points out the lack of clear evidence of an internal rift, because the rift came from outside, not within the antagonist. In this story wasn't the brothers or sisters. It was Nashville's own cold, logical star-making machine. Let's analyze the situation from the label's perspective. In 1967, Tippy Toeing was a huge hit. But in their eyes, it was a novelty song, a one-off hit. How could they possibly follow it up? Follow-up singles like 7 Days of Crying were great, but they failed to capture the lightning in a bottle that Tippy Toeing had. The label began to get nervous. Had they signed a one-hit wonder? The family harmony sound was great, but could it be a sustainable long-term career? The Nashville sound Columbia was competing with was dominating the charts. This was the era of Tammy Wynette, who had just signed to Epic. It was the era of Stand By Your Man. The industry wanted a big, emotional female solo voice. They wanted a star. And when Columbia's producers, and more importantly producers from other rival labels like RCA, looked at the Harden Trio on stage, they all saw the same thing. They saw a strong, solid baritone leader. They saw a quiet, supportive alto harmony singer. And they saw the absolute, undeniable potential of megawatt superstars. They saw Arlene Harden, with her bright, powerful, crystal-clear tenor, was a star on the verge of bursting. She had the looks, she had the charisma, and she had that voice. A voice that could cut through a string session, a voice that could break your heart, a voice that could sell millions of records on its own. In the eyes of the industry's cold, unsympathetic commercial eye, Bobby and Robbie were no longer her partners. They were her backup singers. In effect, they were sabotaging her. This is the quiet, heartbreaking debate at the heart of their story. Sometime in 1967, at the height of their Tippy Toeing fame, a conversation began. It wasn't a public one. It was a quiet, behind-the-scenes meeting over coffee or cocktails. Perhaps it was a polite conversation framed as a great opportunity. Perhaps producers within their own label, Columbia, began to see her potential differently and offered her a new solo opportunity. Arlene, family groups are great. They're a great platform, but you're a star. We can make you the next Tammy Wynette, the next Loretta Lynn. It was a toxic, impossible choice. What should Arlene do? She was only 22. She faced an impossible dilemma. Should she remain loyal to her family, to Bobby, the man who brought them here, and to the Arkansas gospel sound? Should she disappear as a one-hit wonder and risk dragging her siblings down with her? Or should she take the leap? Should she become a solo star, clutching the golden ring every Nashville singer dreams of? It wasn't a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between two different kinds of loyalty. Loyalty to her family's past and loyalty to her own financial future, and perhaps theirs as a whole. In 1967, she made a choice. In a move that signaled the end of the trio, Arlene Harden initially remained with Columbia Records, the same label as the trio, before embarking on a solo career. The breakup began. It wasn't a dramatic public explosion like the Carlisle brothers or the Everly brothers. There were no guitars smashed on stage. It was quieter, more modern, and in many ways far more tragic. It wasn't an implosion. It was a dissection. Although the trio was technically still together, their final group album, Sing Their Favorites, released in 1967, effectively marked their farewell. As a functional and ambitious unit, they were finished. The perfect trio of family harmony was shattered. Not because of a fight, but because of a contract. This wasn't really a betrayal, it was a promotion. It was a process by which the Nashville star-making machine identified its most valuable assets and rescued them from what it deemed ineffective packaging. The family that arrived in Nashville as a single, indivisible, gospel-filled whole was clinically and expertly dismantled into its individual parts. The great gospel tenacity and toughness that united them against Arkansas poverty couldn't stand up to the sophisticated corporate logic of Music Row. The industry didn't want family. It wanted stars. And over the next few years, the three siblings took three completely different, parallel, and lonely paths. One was sent into the spotlight, one was sent to the background, and one was sent into silence. For Dolores Arlene Harden, the choice she made in 1967 was the most crucial and terrifying moment of her life. She was just 22 years old. All her life, her musical identity had been defined by her brother and sister. She was the tenor of the Harden sound, the soaring part. Now the men who had shaped the careers of Elvis Presley and Jim Reeves were looking at her and saying, "Forget them. It's only you." It was a poisoned, irresistible apology. The opportunity every singer in Nashville, including her brother, dreamed of. The psychological weight of this promotion must have been immense. On the one hand, it was the ultimate validation. The secret suspicion that her voice was special was now confirmed by the most powerful people in the world. But on the other hand, it was a profound, albeit unspoken, betrayal of her family. She was the one to jump ship first, leaving her siblings behind. She had to reconcile the guilt of abandoning them with the thrill of her own ascension. To survive, she probably had to believe that her success would be theirs, that her stardom would validate the entire family's journey. Columbia didn't waste a second. Arlene was immediately thrown into the star-making process. Their first task was to take the Harden color out of her sound. The raw, churchy, gospel-infused harmonies that defined her past were the first to be removed. She was thrust into the heart of the Nashville sound, a formula designed to create a polished, radio-friendly, pop crossover star. Her producers wrapped her voice in the richest, most refined sound money could buy: lush, sweeping string sessions, ethereal, flawless harmonies from professional backup singers, and slip-note piano from Nashville's finest. Even her name itself was repackaged. The country-sounding Dolores was abandoned. She became simply and elegantly Arlene Harden, although the label, in its corporate impatience, sometimes misspelled her name on records as Arlene. Her sound, her image, even her name, everything was carefully curated for mainstream success. She was no longer a girl from an Arkansas church choir. She was a thoroughbred racehorse trained by the world's best to win races, a commodity, and the industry's gamble paid off immediately. Her debut solo single for Columbia, My Arms Stay Open Late, was released in 1967. It was a sophisticated, powerful, and emotional ballad, her voice soaring over a sea of strings. It was a sound perfectly suited to the era, and it put her in direct competition with the queens of the country sound, Tammy Wynette and Lynn Anderson. The song was an instant and undisputed hit, reaching the Billboard Country Top 10. Just a year earlier, the girl who had been the lead singer of the novelty group singing about Tippy Toeing was now a serious top-tier country music star in her own right. The validation was absolute. Any guilt or doubt about her decision was washed away by the sound of her own voice, emanating from car radios across America. The machine was right. She was a star. For the next 6 years, from 1967 to 1973, Arlene Harden was a fixture on the country music charts. This wasn't a one-hit wonder career. She was a consistent, reliable, and respected hitmaker. Starting at Columbia, she moved on to Capitol and Elektra Records, scoring a string of chart hits including Loving Man and He's a Good Old Boy. She has successfully transitioned from family harmony to solo artist. She has shed the novelty label of Tippy Toeing and is now a serious artist. But this success, as always, came at a profound and unspoken price. The gospel tenacity that had made her unique, the raw, unfiltered, churchy sound, gone. It was replaced by the professionally polished, slicked up and polished, string-driven sound demanded by the label. She had a career, but she had lost her uniqueness. She was no longer the gospel girl from Arkansas. She had become one of them, one of the many smooth female vocalists who overflowed like a sea of slick-sounding vocalists. Her story is a triumphant tale of assimilation. And in the world of art, assimilation itself is a quiet, velvet-lined tragedy. So what became of Bobby, the foundation of a baritone, a strong family man, an ambitious, independent leader who dreamed, wrote hit songs, and brought his family to Nashville? When the star he supported suddenly vanished, what would happen to his anchor? For Bobby, this was a quiet, devastating, and deeply personal tragedy. The industry, having plucked the star from his group with clinical, surgical precision, had no business with him. He was no longer a lead singer. He was simply a good enough baritone. This is the moment that defines him. This is the moment that reveals his true, unwavering essence, his gospel perseverance after the Great Depression. He had two choices. One option was to retreat, as Cliff Carlisle did. He could have packed his bags, collected his share of the Tippy Toeing money, and returned to Arkansas, a battered, broken man, a forgotten figure in the industry, recounting his near misses in local bars. This would have been the path of a poet built on wounded pride and artistic integrity. But Bobby wasn't a poet, he was a father. His lifelong psychology, shaped in the 1930s, wasn't about art, but about stability. He had a family to support. He was in Nashville, the heart of the industry. He wouldn't crumble, he wouldn't be erased, he would endure. He made a choice. If the industry didn't make him a star, He would become something else. He would become a craftsman. Bobby Harden swallowed his pride. It's a profound and quiet tragedy, almost incomprehensible. The man who led a million-selling band, wrote hit songs, and stood center stage at the Grand Ole Opry now had to rebuild himself from scratch. He became a session musician. He became a hired songwriter. He became a background vocalist. He went from being an artist to a hired hand. Imagine the specific, everyday psychological toll of this existence. He would get a call for an hourly session job. He would walk into Columbia's Studio A, and in the hallway he would see a giant promotional poster for his sister, Arlene's new hit single. Then he would be led to a back corner of the studio where he would stand with other anonymous harmony singers. He would be forced to make oohs and ahs on the recording of a less talented newcomer who had just received the star treatment he had been denied. He would have had to sit in the audience at the Opry, the stage he once commanded, watching his sister sing her new solo hit, accompanied by other musicians. He was the ghost in his own success story. But this is the core of his character. He did it. He persevered. He didn't show his bitterness, at least not publicly. Instead, he became a universally respected figure. He became the ultimate pro among pros. He became a man who stayed. He put his head down, got to work, and built a new life. He became a successful songwriter, writing for such luminaries as Loretta Lynn and Conway Twitty, and a respected session leader and harmony singer. He knew what a hit harmony sound was because he made it. He spent the rest of his life in the Nashville machine, not as a star, but as an essential, working, and respected part of that engine. He achieved his lifelong goal of financial stability. He ultimately sacrificed the addictive glory of fame for the dignity of profound lifelong stability. This was the core of his tragic, noble, and ultimately strong story. And then there was Robbie, the youngest, a soft alto, glue. In this entire three-act tragedy, her story is the quietest, the shortest, and perhaps the most profound. In the cold, dispassionate dissection of the Harden Trio, the machine knew exactly what to do with the other two components. Arlene was the star, a marketable, high-value commodity. Bobby was the craftsman, a useful and skilled baritone and composer, ready for the session world. But Robbie, what was she? In the commercial language of the industry, she was an alto. She was a harmony singer. She was glue. And the terrible unspoken truth about the star-making system is that it's useless for glue. It's a system that glorifies bricks, not mortar. Her voice, essential to the trio, wasn't commercially viable on its own. She lacked Arlene's flashy star power. She lacked Barbie's most drive or songwriting skills. She was expendable in the industry's eyes. In many ways, she faced the cruelest of choices. She could swallow her pride like Bobby did and try to make a living as a low-level, anonymous, hired backup singer. She could spend her life in the shadows of the studio, singing harmonies for others, constantly and painfully reminded of the magic she once was a part of. Her. She could simply walk away. Robbie Harden chose a different path, one neither in the solo spotlight nor in the shadows of the studio. She didn't disappear immediately, as is often assumed. She briefly joined the renowned folk group, the New Christie Minstrels, in the early 70s, attempting to find a new home for her essential harmony voice. But that position wasn't permanent. It only served to prove what the industry had already decided. There's no place for a harmony expert without family. Ultimately, she chose to step away from the machine entirely. She chose the quiet, private life her older brother and sister couldn't live. She chose an ordinary life, a life of family, and a life in the world, far from the oppressive and judgmental spotlight of Music Row. She became the ghost of the Harden Trio, a silent testimony to a vast and nuanced talent that defies the industry's simple categorization. Her silence is the most profound statement in this entire story. It is the voice of someone who chose to remain whole rather than disintegrate into parts. The family, who arrived in Nashville as an unbreakable trio, were dissected and classified by experts, clinically, without shedding a single drop of blood. The machine had a star, it had a craftsman, and the third part, the glue that held it all together, was quietly and efficiently discarded. The decades following this momentous turning point were a long, quiet epilogue. The war was over. The path was set. Alan's once bright solo career peaked in the mid-1970s. As the outlaw movement of Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings began to supplant the smooth Nashville sound, her polished brand of country pop began to feel dated. Her hits dried up. She, too, eventually faded from the charts, forever remembered as a solid second-tier star of the country era. The industry's promise of a megastar, the next Tammy Wynette, never quite materialized. She was a star but not a superstar. Meanwhile, Bobby persevered. He was the ultimate Nashville survivor. He became a beloved figure in the recording world, a pillar of the community. He was someone who saw it all firsthand. He worked on sessions, wrote songs, and mentored young artists. His tough spirit and lack of bitterness earned him deep and lasting respect. He was a living piece of history, writing and singing lead vocals on a massive crossover hit that nearly made him one of the world's biggest stars. He never achieved great fame or fortune again, but he achieved something far rarer, and to him, more important, he achieved his main life goal. He achieved stability. He had a real job in the music industry, a respected skill. He owned a home. He had a family. He won in his own quiet way. He survived the machine not by beating it, but by joining it in his own way. He never, ever returned to the poverty of Arkansas. When Bobby Harden passed away on May 30th, 2006, it wasn't front-page news. It was a quiet death, noted by industry insiders and dedicated music historians. It was a respectful and dignified end for a 70-year-old man who had been a beloved hardcore figure in the Nashville community for 40 years. But to the world, his death marked the official and final end of the Harden Trio. The baritone anchor, the independent leader who staked everything on the dream of family harmony, the man who was the foundation of their rise and the first casualty of their success, was finally silenced. In the old analog world, the story would have ended there. Back in 2006, the Harden Trio's legacy was simple and brutal. They were a one-hit wonder. They were the name of a quiz question, synonymous with a catchy novelty song from 1966. The quiet alto Robbies remained private citizens for decades. Their other album, Sing Their Favorites, was out of print, long forgotten, and removed from the Columbia Records catalog. Their master tapes sat in a climate-controlled vault, literally like ghosts in the machine, the property of a corporation that had long since forgotten them. The machine identified the star, extracted it, and discarded the rest. The dissection was complete, seemingly permanent. The analog world, controlled by record executives, producers, and radio programmers, declared that their story was over. But a new world was being born. The rise of the internet, particularly YouTube in 2005 and Spotify in 2008, created a new, disruptive, and democratic machine. This new machine was not controlled by a handful of Nashville producers, but by the algorithmic curiosity of the public. It was a machine built not on creating stars, but on rediscovering them. And for the first time, power shifted from the executive suite to the listener's living room. In this new digital world, history was no longer written solely by commercial winners forgotten, discarded, and one-hit wonders were suddenly being given a second life. Ghosts in the machine were becoming songs in the cloud. And starting in the 2000s, the music of the long silent Harden Trio began to find a new global audience. A grainy black and white television clip of them singing Tippy Toeing on the Porter Wagoner show was uploaded, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people were seeing and hearing them for the first time. The first wave of this revival, of course, was the hit song itself. Tippy Toeing remains an immortal, undeniable piece of feel-good country music that's impossible to dislike. It's been streamed millions of times by a new generation who never heard it on the radio, and it's starting to appear on country classics playlists. But unlike the radio listeners of 1966, this new audience possessed new power. They could click on an artist's name. They could ask the algorithm, "Show me more," and the algorithm, connected to the newly digitized Columbia Legacy Archive, readily obliged. Suddenly, listeners were searching for the album. They were listening to the B-sides. They were hearing the pure, spine-chilling gospel harmonies of Sing Their Favorites. They were hearing the raw, authentic sound before the Nashville machine refined them and then destroyed them. The anatomy was slowly and digitally reversed. The public was finally hearing the full story and beginning to understand the depth of the tragedy. As time has passed and clarity has grown, history has reassessed the legacy of the Harden Trio. They are no longer one-hit wonders. They are now considered pioneers, but they are also undeniably scapegoats. Their story is a prime example of the destruction wrought by the Nashville machine. They are a tragic bridge. They bridge the gap between raw family harmony and the later commercialized family group. They demonstrated a formula for success, but they were also dissected by the industry to learn from it. The lesson was not that family harmony sells, but that female stars sell. The Judds' success 20 years later was built on the failures of the Harden Trio. The industry didn't try to separate Naomi and Winona from the Judds because they learned from the Harden Trio. The Harden Trio's contribution was twofold. On the one hand, they were a test. The industry learned how to identify and extract stars from family members. On the other hand, they brought a raw, unfiltered, gospel-sounding sound to top 40 radio. It was a pioneering act that proved that authentic sound could have mass appeal. It was a lesson that the outlaw movement would revolutionize a decade later. The ultimate and most heartbreaking truth is that the Harden Trio didn't fail, but rather succeeded so spectacularly in that one perfect moment. That moment revealed their true potential, but the machine intervened, preventing them from ever reaching that potential again. The industry didn't simply break up the band, they destroyed the sound. But thanks to the new machine, the digital machine, that perfect and fragile moment is no longer lost. The separation has been reversed. Now we can hear them not as stars, not as artisans, not as entities in memory, as one family, as one harmony, as one whole.